The twin suns of Surith IV burned hot and bright over the endless desert, and the sand stretched in every direction like a golden ocean that never moved. And the heat was so strong that even the rocks seemed to shimmer and dance in the light. The Vakari had lived on this harsh world for thousands of years, and they were proud of their survival. And they believed that only the strong deserved to live under these burning skies. They were tall reptilian beings with scales, the color of burnt amber and copper, and their eyes were protected by thick inner lids that blocked the worst of the sunlight. And their bodies were built to absorb heat and turn it into energy. The Vakari did not believe in weakness, and they did not believe in mercy for those who were born different. And they had a tradition that was older than anyone could remember. When a hatchling was born wrong, it was taken to the ghost dunes and left there to declutch mother. Theska was a respected elder in the settlement of Karveth, and she had produced many healthy clutches over her long life. And she was proud of her genetic line when her latest eggs began to crack open in the warm hatching chamber. She watched with satisfaction as 11 perfect hatchlings emerged one by one. And each one had the proper amber scales, and each one had the strong protective eyes. And each one cried out with healthy voices. But then the 12th egg cracked open, and everything changed. The hatchling that crawled out was small and weak, and its scales were not amber but pale white like bleached bone, and its eyes were not dark and protected but pink and watery. And it squinted and cried as even the dim light of the hatching chamber caused it pain. Theska felt her heart sink in her chest, and she stepped back from the pale creature as if it carried a disease. And the other mothers in the chamber whispered and pointed and shook their heads. An albino had been born. The word spread quickly through Karveth, and soon the elders gathered in the hatching chamber to see the defective hatchling for themselves. And they stood in a circle around it and spoke in low voices. "It cannot survive the suns," said Elder Korath, his old scales clicking as he moved. "It will be blind within days if it goes outside, and it will be a burden on the settlement forever." "The law is clear," said Elder Metis, her voice cold and firm. "We do not waste resources on those who cannot contribute, and we do not weaken our bloodlines with defective genes." Theska looked down at the pale hatchling that had come from her own body, and she searched inside herself for some feeling of connection or love. But she found nothing except disappointment and shame. "Take it to the ghost dunes," she said, and her voice did not shake, and her eyes did not water. "Let the tradition be followed." The albino hatchling did not understand what was happening when strong hands lifted it from the warm sand of the hatching chamber, and it did not understand why it was being carried away from its siblings. And it chirped and cried and reached out with tiny, clawed hands. 2 young Vakari males carried the hatchling across the settlement and out into the open desert. And they walked for a long time until they reached a place where the dunes were white instead of gold. And this was the ghost dunes where the rejected ones were left. The white sand was made from the bones of countless generations of abandoned hatchlings. And the young males did not think about this as they set the albino down on the hot ground. And they did not look back as they walked away. The hatchling sat alone on the burning sand, and the twin suns beat down on its pale, sensitive scales, and the light stabbed into its pink eyes like knives. It cried out for its mother, but no answer came. It tried to crawl toward the shadows, but there were no shadows in the ghost dunes, and there was nowhere to hide from the killing light. Hours passed, and the hatchling grew weaker, and its cries became softer. And it curled into a tiny ball and tried to protect its eyes with its small hands. Night came at last, and the cold was almost as bad as the heat, and the hatchling shivered and whimpered in the darkness. And it did not understand why it had been thrown away, and it did not understand what it had done wrong. It only knew that it was alone, and that no one was coming to save it. The first day passed, and then the second day, and the hatchling stopped crying because it did not have the strength anymore. And it stopped moving because every movement hurt too much. It lay on its side in the white sand, and its pale scales were cracked and burned, and its pink eyes were swollen nearly shut. And it waited for the end to come. This was how it was supposed to be, according to Vakari tradition, and this was how it had always been. And no one in Karveth thought about the small white creature dying alone in the Dunnis. Theska returned to her 11 healthy hatchlings and began teaching them the ways of the Vakari. And she did not speak of the 12th one. And soon it was as if it had never existed at all. The other Vakari went about their daily lives, and they traded goods and argued politics and planned for the future. And none of them looked toward the ghost dunes but out in the white sand. The albino hatchling was still alive, and it clung to life with a stubbornness that it did not understand. And something inside, it refused to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier on the morning of the third day. When the hatchling had accepted that death was coming and had stopped fighting against it, a new sound broke the silence of the desert. It was a rumbling growl that came from beyond the dunes, and it was getting closer. And the hatchling lifted its head just slightly and listened with the last of its strength. Something was coming, something, different something that would change everything. Marcus Chen had been driving cargo haulers across alien worlds for 15 years, and he had seen many strange things in that time. But he had never gotten used to the loneliness of the long desert runs. His hauler was a massive vehicle with 8 wheels and a cabin that could keep him alive in almost any environment. And it rumbled across the dunes of Surith 4 like a metal beast searching for water. He was carrying medical supplies from the human outpost at New Jakarta to a mining settlement 300 kilometers to the east. And the route took him through empty wasteland where nothing lived and nothing grew. The Vakari did not like humans very much, and they called them soft skins and short livers. And they thought humans were weak because they could not survive the twin suns without special suits and filtered helmets. Marcus did not care what the Vakari thought of him, and he just wanted to do his job and get paid and maybe find a cold drink at the end of the road. He was humming an old song from Earth when the scanner on his dashboard beeped, and he looked down at the screen and frowned at what he saw. There was a life sign in the ghost dunes. Marcus had been warned about the ghost dunes when he first started running this route, and the other human drivers had told him to never stop there no matter what. And they said it was a sacred place to the Vakari, where they did things that humans should not ask about. But the scanner was showing a small life form, and it was weak and fading, and something in Marcus could not just drive past. I turned the hauler toward the white sand, and the wheels crunched over old bones that he tried not to think about. And he scanned the dunes until he found the source of the signal. It was so small that he almost missed it. A tiny pale creature lay curled in the sand, and its white scales were burned and cracked, and it was barely breathing. And Marcus felt his heart clench in his chest when he realized what he was looking at. It was a baby, and someone had left it here to die. He stopped the hauler and grabbed his cooling jacket and his water bottle, and he jumped down from the cabin and ran across the hot sand toward the tiny body. The hatchling did not move when he knelt beside it, and for a terrible moment Marcus thought he was too late. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of its chest, and he let out a breath of relief. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. And he reached out with gentle hands and lifted the hatchling from the burning ground. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The hatchling opened its swollen eyes just a crack, and Marcus saw that they were pink instead of dark like other Vakari. And he understood then why this baby had been abandoned. He had read about Vakari customs in the cultural briefings that all human workers had to study, and he knew about their harsh views on genetic differences, and he knew that they considered albinos to be defective and worthless. But looking down at the tiny creature in his hands, Marcus did not see something defective or worthless, and he only saw a child who needed help. He wrapped the hatchling in his cooling jacket and the special fabric was designed to keep human bodies safe from the heat. And he hoped it would work for this small reptilian baby too. He carried the hatchling back to the hauler and climbed into the cabin. And he laid it gently on the passenger seat and looked at it with worried eyes. "Okay," he said to himself. And he ran his hands through his hair and tried to think, "Okay, Marcus, what do you know about Vicari biology?" He knew they needed heat to survive. But this one was clearly suffering from too much sun. And he knew they ate meat and insects, but he did not have any of those things. And he knew they drank water just like humans did. He opened his water bottle and carefully dripped a few drops into the hatchling's mouth. And he watched as its throat moved weakly and swallowed. And he dripped a few more drops and waited. The hatchling's eyes opened a little wider, and it looked up at Marcus with confusion and fear. And it made a small chirping sound that might have been a question. "You are safe now," Marcus said. And he did not know if the hatchling could understand him, but he hoped his voice sounded gentle. "I am not going to hurt you. And I am not going to leave you." He adjusted the climate controls in the cabin to make it cooler and darker. And he pulled the sun shields down over the windows. And he watched as the hatchling slowly began to relax. Its burned scales still looked painful, and its eyes still watered in even the dim light, but it was breathing more steadily now. And it had stopped shaking. Marcus looked at the hatchling for a long time, and he thought about what he should do next. He could take it to the Vicari settlement and give it back to them. But he knew they would just bring it back to the ghost dunes and leave it to die again. He could take it to the human outpost and ask the doctors there to help it. But he did not know if they would know how to treat a Vicari baby, or he could keep it with him and try to figure things out as he went along. Hatchling chirped again and reached out with one tiny clawed hand, and its fingers wrapped around Marcus's thumb, and it held on tight as if it never wanted to let go. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, and he knew in that moment that he could not give this baby up, and he could not send it back to a people who did not want it. "All right, little one," he said, and he smiled down at the pale creature holding his thumb. "I guess you are coming with me, and we will figure this out together." He started the hauler's engine, and the vehicle rumbled back to life. And he drove away from the ghost dunes with a new passenger that he had not expected. The medical supplies would be late to the mining settlement, and Marcus would have to explain why. But he did not care about that right now. All he cared about was the small white hatchling sleeping in the cooling jacket on the seat beside him, and the feeling that maybe he had been meant to drive this road on this day for exactly this reason. The twin suns blazed overhead, and the desert stretched out before him, and Marcus Chun drove toward an uncertain future with hope in his heart. The first weeks were the hardest, and Marcus made many mistakes as he tried to learn how to care for a creature that was so different from himself. He learned that the hatchling needed protein, and he found that dried meat sticks from his emergency rations worked well enough. And he learned to cut them into tiny pieces that the small mouth could chew. He learned that the hatchling needed warmth at night, but shade during the day. And he adjusted his schedule so that he drove mostly after dark when the twin suns were hidden. And he rested during the hottest hours in the shaded cabin. He learned that the hatchling's pink eyes were extremely sensitive to light. And he spent 3 days working with spare parts and tools until he created a tiny pair of goggles from welding lenses and leather straps. And when he fitted them over the hatchling's face, the little creature chirped with happiness for the first time. "There you go," Marcus said with a grin, and he adjusted the straps so they would not pinch. "Now you can actually see where you are going." The hatchling looked around the cabin with wonder, and its protected eyes took in all the strange human technology and blinking lights. And it reached out to touch everything with curious clawed fingers. Marcus decided the hatchling needed a name, and he thought about it for a long time as he drove through the desert night. The creature was an albino, born sensitive to the sun, cursed to hide from the light that its people worshipped. And there was a sad irony in that which Marcus could not ignore. "I am going to call you Soul," he said to the hatchling. And he smiled at his own dark humor. "It means sun in an old Earth language. And I think you should own the thing that was supposed to destroy you." Soul chirped and tilted its head. And it did not understand the joke, but it understood that it had been given a name. And that meant it belonged to someone now. The weeks turned into months, and Soul grew bigger and stronger. And the burned scales healed and were replaced by new ones that were still pale but healthy, and Smooth Marcus installed special UV filters on all the windows of his hauler. And he bought a small portable shelter that Soul could hide in during the brightest hours. And he learned to always carry extra water, and extra meat. Saul learned too. And the young Vicari watched Marcus with intense attention and copied the sounds he made. And slowly it began to understand and speak human words. "Marcus," Soul said one evening as the twin suns set behind the dunes. And it was the first clear word the hatchling had ever spoken. And Marcus had to wipe his eyes before he could respond. "That is right, little one," he said. And his voice was thick with emotion. "I am Marcus, and you are Soul. And we are a team now." Soul followed Marcus everywhere, like a small white shadow. And it chirped with distress when Marcus had to leave the hauler to load cargo or talk to clients. And it chirped with joy when he returned. The human workers at the outpost were amazed by Soul, and they had never seen a Vicari bond with another species before. And they gathered around Marcus's hauler to watch the pale hatchling, and its tiny goggles peek out from behind the human's legs. "Did not think that was possible," said Dr. Yuki Tanaka at the New Jakarta Medical Station. And she scanned Soul with her instruments and shook her head in wonder. "Vicari are supposed to be completely indifferent to other species, and they do not form attachments outside their own kind. Maybe no one ever tried being kind to them before," Marcus said. And he scratched Soul's head in the way the young Vicari liked. And Soul closed its eyes and made a purring sound word spread through the human settlements. And soon everyone knew about the cargo hauler driver who had rescued an albino Vicari hatchling from the ghost dunes. And the story was passed from outpost to outpost until it reached places Marcus had never been. And eventually, the word reached the Vicari too. At first they dismissed the rumors as human nonsense, and they could not believe that one of their discarded ones was still alive. And they certainly could not believe that it had bonded with a soft skin, but the stories kept coming. And travelers reported seeing a human hauler with strange dark windows, and a pale Vicari child wearing goggles and following a human man like a devoted pet. The elders of Karveth began to whisper among themselves. And Clutch Mother Theska heard the whispers and felt something cold settle in her chest. She had not thought about the albino since the day it was taken to the ghost dunes, and she had assumed it was dead within hours like all the others. And she had moved on with her life as if it had never existed. But now she learned that it was alive, and it was being raised by a human. And it was apparently happy and healthy despite everything her people believed about its defects. This should not have been possible. And it went against everything the Vicari knew about genetics and survival and the natural order of things. And Theska found that she did not know how to feel about this. And she did not know whether to be angry or confused or something else entirely. Meanwhile, Marcus and Soul continued their life together on the desert roads of Sireth 4. And they did not know that they had become famous. And they did not know that their simple existence was causing ripples through Vicar society. They just knew that they had each other. And that was enough. Saul grew taller and learned more words every day. And Marcus taught the young Vicari about human culture and human values and the human belief that every life had worth regardless of how it looked or what abilities it had or lacked. Why did my people leave me to die? Sol asked one night, and the question came suddenly as they sat together watching the stars. Through the filtered windows, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. And he did not want to lie to Sol, but he also did not want to make the young Vicari hate its own kind, because they were afraid, he finally said. And he put his arm around Sol's thin shoulders. They were afraid of what was different. And they did not understand that different does not mean wrong. Sol thought about this for a while. And then it leaned against Marcus and closed its pink eyes. I am glad you are not afraid. Sol said softly. Marcus held the young Vicari close and looked out at the stars and thought about how strange life could be. And how sometimes the best things happened when you were brave enough to stop and help someone who needed it. Me too, little one, he said. Me too. The Vicari delegation arrived at New Jakarta Outpost on a morning when the twin suns burned particularly bright, and their armored transport vehicles kicked up clouds of golden dust as they approached the human settlement. Marcus had been warned by the outpost director that they were coming, and he had thought about running away and hiding Sol somewhere the Vicari would never find. But he knew that running would only delay the inevitable, so he stood in front of his hauler with Sol behind him. And he waited for the confrontation that he had always known would come eventually. The lead vehicle stopped and the doors opened. And 5 Vicari emerged into the sunlight with their amber scales gleaming and their dark eyes unreadable. The tallest one stepped forward, and Marcus recognized authority in the way she moved and the way the others deferred to her. I am Clutch Mother Theska of Karveth, she said, and her voice was cold and formal. I have come to reclaim what belongs to my settlement. Marcus felt Sol's clawed hand grip the back of his shirt, and he could feel the young Vicari trembling with fear. And he stood a little taller and kept his voice steady. Sol belongs to no one but herself, he said. And he used the female pronoun because Sol had recently decided that was correct. And she is not going anywhere she does not want to go. Theska's eyes narrowed, and the scales around her neck flared slightly in what Marcus had learned was a sign of anger. You have given it a name, she said, and there was disgust in her voice. You have treated a defective cast-off as if it were a person. She is a person, Marcus replied. And he did not back down. She is smart and kind and brave. And she has more worth than you ever bothered to look for. The other Vicari shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus could see that they had not expected a human to speak to a clutch mother this way, and they did not know how to react. Theska stepped closer, and she was taller than Marcus by nearly a head, and she looked down at him with contempt. You do not understand our ways, human, she said. We have survived on this harsh world for thousands of years because we do not waste resources on those who cannot contribute. And we do not weaken our genetic lines with defective specimens. I understand your ways perfectly, Marcus said. And anger crept into his voice, despite his efforts to stay calm. You throw away children because they look different. And you tell yourselves it is tradition so you do not have to feel guilty about murder. Theska hissed, and her claws extended slightly, and the other Vicari tensed as if preparing for violence. You dare to lecture us about morality, Theska said. You soft-skins who cannot survive a single day under our suns without your machines and your suits. You think you can tell us how to manage our own kind. I think I can tell you that leaving a baby to die alone in the desert is wrong, Marcus said. And I do not need to survive your sons to know that. For a long moment they stared at each other, and the tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. And neither one was willing to look away first. Then a small voice spoke from behind Marcus, and everyone turned to look at Sol as she stepped out from her hiding place. Mother, Sol said, and the word hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica flinched. And for the first time, Marcus saw something other than cold contempt in her eyes. And it might have been surprise, or it might have been shame. Sol walked forward on trembling legs, and she stopped between Marcus and Theska. And she looked up at the clutch mother who had ordered her death. "I remember the hatching chamber," Sol said. And her voice shook, but she kept speaking. "I remember being warm and safe, and then I remember being carried away. And I remember crying for someone to come back for me." Theska said nothing, and her scales had gone very still. "No one came," Sol continued, and there were tears in her pink eyes now. "I lay in the sand for 3 days, and I was so hot and so scared. And I thought I was going to die alone without ever knowing why." The other Valkyrie looked at the ground, and Marcus could see that Sol's words were affecting them, even if they did not want to admit it. "Then Marcus came," Sol said, and she reached back to take the human's hand without looking away from Theska. "He did not know me, and he did not have any reason to help me. But he stopped anyway, and he saved me anyway." Sol squeezed Marcus's hand, and he squeezed back. "You ask why he treats me like a person," Sol said, and her voice grew stronger. "He treats me like a person because he looked at me and saw a person. And that is more than you ever did." Theska opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I am not going with you," Sol said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I am staying with Marcus because he is my family. And family does not throw you away when you are inconvenient." The silence stretched out long and painful, and the twin suns beat down on all of them. And Marcus watched the expressions shift on the Valkyrie faces like clouds moving across a sky. Finally, Theska spoke, and her voice was not cold anymore, and it was not angry. And it was something Marcus did not have a word for. "You speak well," she said to Sol. "Better than many who were not cast out." Sol did not respond, and she just stood her ground with her hand in Marcus's hand. Theska looked at Marcus then, and something complicated moved behind her dark eyes. "You have made a fool of our traditions, human," she said. "You have proven that something we believed for thousands of years was wrong." "I did not set out to prove anything," Marcus said. "I just saw a child who needed help." Theska was quiet for another long moment, and then she turned and walked back toward her vehicle. And the other Valkyrie followed her with confused expressions. She stopped at the door and looked back one last time. "Keep her safe, human," she said. And then she was gone. The vehicles drove away into the desert, and Marcus and Sol stood together and watched them go. And neither of them spoke until the dust had settled and the silence had returned. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly. Sol leaned against him and let out a long breath. "I think I am," she said. "I think I finally am." The years that followed the confrontation brought changes that no one had expected. And the ripples from that single meeting spread outward like waves in a pond until they touched shores that Marcus and Sol could never have imagined. The Valkyrie delegation returned to Karveth with a story that troubled the elders and confused the young. And they spoke of an albino who should have died, but instead had learned to speak and think and feel. Just like any normal Valkyrism dismissed the story as human trickery or exaggeration. And they insisted that the old ways were correct and that weakness should still be culled from the bloodlines. But others began to wonder. And they asked questions that had never been asked before. And they looked toward the ghost dunes with new eyes and heavy hearts. A young Valkyrie named Koros was the first to publicly challenge the tradition. And he stood before the council and asked how many geniuses and artists and leaders had been left to die simply because they looked different. The elders silenced him and called him a traitor to his kind. But his words had been heard, and the seed of doubt had been planted in many minds. Meanwhile, Sol grew taller and stronger with each passing season, and her pale scales developed beautiful silver patterns that no other Valkyrie had ever seen. And her pink eyes behind their protective goggles were sharp and intelligent. Marcus taught her everything he knew about machines and navigation and the business of hauling cargo across hostile worlds. And Sol learned quickly, and soon she was helping him with repairs and route planning and negotiations with clients. She never forgot the tiny goggles that Marcus had made for her from welding lenses. And even after she outgrew them and needed new ones, she kept the originals hanging from her belt as a reminder of where she had come from and who had saved her when Sol was old enough. She applied to join the Interspecies Transport Guild, and she became the first Vekari to ever serve on a mixed-species cargo cruise. Other species in the guild were curious about her at first, and they asked many questions about her pale scales and her goggles and her unusual upbringing. And Sol answered them all with patience and good humor. She told them about the ghost dunes and the tradition of casting out. And she told them about the human driver who had stopped when he did not have to. And she told them about the years of learning and growing and becoming who she was meant to be. Her crewmates listened with fascination, and they passed her story along to others. And soon Sol became famous across multiple star systems as the Albino. The Dakari, who had been saved by human kindness news agencies, began to request interviews. And Sol agreed to speak with a journalist from the Galactic Broadcasting Network about her life and her experiences. The interview was broadcast across hundreds of worlds, and billions of beings watched as Sol sat in a comfortable chair and answered questions about her past. "Your people rejected you because of your appearance," the journalist said. "But a human stranger saved your life at great personal risk. And now you work alongside species from all over the galaxy. How do you explain that?" Sol thought carefully before she answered, and she looked directly into the camera with her pink eyes bright behind her goggles. "My people looked at me when I was born," she said, "and they saw only what I lacked. They saw scales that were the wrong color and eyes that could not handle the light. And they decided that these things made me worthless." She paused and touched the tiny goggles hanging from her belt. "Marcus looked at me when I was dying in the sand," she continued, "and he did not see what I lacked. He saw what I could become if someone just gave me a chance." The journalist leaned forward with interest. "What do you think that says about humans?" she asked. Sol smiled, and it was an expression she had learned from Marcus years ago. "Humans do not see with their eyes," she said. "They see with something else, something inside them that looks for possibility instead of limitation. Something that asks not what you are, but what you might be." The interview was watched and discussed across the galaxy, and Sol's words became famous. And they were quoted in schools and universities and council chambers on worlds she had never visited on. Zurith IV, the young Vekari, watched the interview with particular attention. And they looked at this confident, successful albino who should have been dead. And they began to question everything they had been taught. The tradition of casting out did not end overnight, and the elders clung to their old beliefs with stubborn determination. But fewer and fewer families brought their different hatchlings to the ghost dune. Some kept their albinos and their runts and their oddly marked children in secret, and they raised them in the shadows and taught them to hide. But at least they raised them. Others were bolder, and they brought their different hatchlings into the light and dared anyone to challenge them. And slowly the definition of what made a Vekari worthy began to change. Klut's mother, Theska, watched all of this from her position of declining influence, and she thought often about the pale hatchling she had ordered thrown away. And she wondered what else she might have been wrong about. She never reached out to Sol, and Sol never reached out to her. And perhaps some wounds were too deep to ever fully heal, but Theska made one small change before she died. And she ordered that no more hatchlings from her line would be sent to the ghost dunes regardless of how they looked. And that was something at least Marcus retired from cargo hauling when his body grew too old for the long desert runs. And he settled in a small house at the New Jakarta outpost, where the climate was controlled, and the twin suns could not reach him. Sol visited him whenever her ship passed through the system, and they sat together on his porch and watched the stars come out, and remembered the old days when it had been just the two of them against the universe. "I saw your interview," Marcus said one evening, and his voice was soft with age but still warm with love. "That thing you said about how humans see, that was beautiful. Sol reached over and took his weathered hand in her clawed one. "It was just the truth," she said. "You taught me that the way someone sees the world matters more than anything else. And you saw a dying child in the sand, and you stopped to help." Marcus smiled and squeezed her hand. "I just did what anyone would do," he said. Sol shook her head. "No," she said gently. "You did what only a human would do, and that made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence as the night grew darker, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. And somewhere out in the galaxy, humans were stopping to help other beings who needed them, because that was what humans did. They saw possibility. Where others saw only limitation, they found hope. Where others saw only despair, and they saved the ones that everyone else had given up on. Sol looked at the old man beside her, and she felt grateful beyond words for the day his rumbling beast of a hauler had crested the ghost dunes and changed her life forever. "Thank you, Marcus," she said softly. "For everything." Marcus smiled and closed his eyes. "You are welcome, little one," he said. "You are welcome." And outside the window, the stars shone down on a galaxy that was a little bit kinder than it had been before, one stopped hauler at a time.